If you're there with me, John chapter 18, will you say amen? We'll begin in verse 33. Then Pilate went back to the headquarters, and he summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "Are you asking this on your own, or have others told you about me?" "I'm not a Jew, am I?" Pilate replied. "Your own nation and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" Pilate, remember, was the Roman governor of Judea and Jerusalem. He was in Jerusalem because of the Passover festival. The Jewish leaders had sent some guards and some Roman soldiers to capture Jesus. They got and arrested him in the Garden of Gethsemane, and they took him first to the Jewish high priest, the Jewish religious and political leaders of the day. And they had a illicit trial, illegal trial in the middle of the night. They found him guilty of blasphemy that was punishable by death, and they sent him to the Roman governor. They wanted him to die by crucifixion, and so they brought him to Pilate, the governor, and asked him to adjudicate a trial in which Jesus would be found guilty and would be executed by crucifixion. However, Pilate was not able to simply rubber stamp their demands. Pilate first appeals to justice. He's going to give Jesus a fair shake. And so in appealing to justice, he brings Jesus in. They go into the judgment hall, and Pilate begins to question him and ask him about the case. And the first question he asks is, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, the reason that he asks that question, he says later that the Jews brought and handed Jesus over to Pilate. No doubt the Jews would have talked about this idea of being a king, and that would be a big deal because at this time, the Romans were in charge of Jerusalem and Judea and this area, and they had a leader, the emperor, the king, called Caesar. The Caesar was the king. And if someone claimed to be a king and have a kingdom and have followers, they would be in rebellion against the Caesar. And if you were busted for rebellion and treason and you were tried and found guilty, it would be punishable by death. The Jews hoped that Pilate would find that he was claiming to be a king and that he would rule that he was guilty of treason and execute him. And so that's where he starts. And Jesus says, "Well, are you asking this on your own accord?" In other words, are you asking this from a Roman perspective, or did somebody else tell you? Are you asking it from the Jews' perspective? Because that's going to change how Jesus answers the question. And he says, "Well, I'm not a Jew, am I? I don't know what they're saying. I don't know what this means when they say this. They're the ones that handed you over. They're the ones that are talking about being a king." And so Jesus says, "Okay, I know how to answer this question." Look at what he says in verse 36. "My kingdom is not of this world." In other words, it is not a kingdom as the world or earth or human defines a kingdom. If you had a kingdom here on earth, you would have a king, you would have a government, you would have a military, you would have followers, you would have taxes, you would have all of these things that a kingdom has. But Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world." It's not like what you're thinking about. If my kingdom were of this world, I would have servants, I would have followers, I would have a military. I would be fighting so that I would not be detained and arrested by you, so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. His kingdom was not an earthly kingdom, it was a heavenly kingdom. Pilate then says, "You are a king then," and that was right. And by saying "my kingdom," he was acknowledging, "I am a king." And Pilate says, "You are a king then." And then Jesus replied, "You say that I'm king, and you're right. I was born for this. I have come into the world for this, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Now, what he's saying here is that his kingdom does not center on a nationality or a race or a language or some type of commonality found on earth. His kingdom is unified by the truth. And he says, "I've come to testify about the truth." Now, what was the truth? Anything that's true, yes, but specifically in the book of John, what is the truth? Jesus said, "I am the and the life." It wasn't just that Jesus was true, it was Jesus was the truth. And so when he comes, he was testifying about himself. And it says those that listen to me are those that are in the truth. The idea is that his kingdom revolves around those who have accepted the truth of Jesus Christ. And truth is what unifies them. It's not a skin tone. It is not a continent on which you live. It's not a language that you speak. We are all part of the kingdom of God as long as we accept the truth. And his name is Jesus. Notice how Pilate answers. What is truth? Pilate said. Now, Pilate was not an ignoramus. He was an educated man. He knew the definition of truth. He grew up with the Roman virtues and the Greek virtues, and he knew what truth was. He knew what the concept of truth is. When he said, what is truth? He was not saying, give me a definition. What he was saying is, what does truth have to do with it? What does truth have to do with any of this? What he was acknowledging is that people do not operate according to what is true. They operate however they want to operate. What does truth have to do with anything? And he gives us a test case here in verse next. So look at the end of verse 38. And after he had said this, within the context of that statement, he went out to the Jews again and he told them, I find no grounds for charging him. At this point, what Pilate should have done is he should have said, I am releasing him. He is out of here. No, nothing else. It's over. That's the end of it. However, Pilate revealed himself to be a coward because Pilate did not do what was right. He was more concerned about how the Jews would respond to the truth, to justice, than he was being just. And so he came up with a plan, and this plan would release Jesus, but it would allow Pilate not to have to make a judgment. It would keep Pilate safe from the vitriol of the Jewish leaders. And so he put together this plan. There was a custom, not sure exactly when this came into play or where it came from, but he alludes to a custom. Look, it says, you have a custom that I release one prisoner to you at the Passover. Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? That's Jesus. Now, in the other Gospels, it talks about this episode, and it says that Pilate's the one that offers Barabbas, a guy named Barabbas. Barabbas was a murderer, an insurrectionist, a rebel. He was someone that was justifiably in prison and was going to go to the cross. I mean, that really is what's going to happen for Barabbas. They didn't want to get rid of Jesus, but he thought, according to justice, according to truth, that they definitely would not want to get rid of Barabbas. So he says, hey, who's the worst person in the prison? Barabbas, all right, bring him out. So are y'all going to pick Jesus or Barabbas? Surely not Barabbas. If they were operating and had their wits about them and were operating according to truth and justice, they would choose to release Jesus, not Barabbas. But what do? They shouted back in verse 40, not this man, but Barabbas. Barabbas was a revolutionary. A normal person would have looked at that situation and said, Jesus needs to be released, Barabbas needs to be punished, but they were not operating in a sensible way. They were being senseless because they were rejecting the truth. They were rejecting justice. First takeaway, you ready? The rebellious world does not care about justice. They do not care about the truth. They have made up their mind, and they do not care if something is true or not. Well, he didn't get his way. He wanted to release Jesus, and it didn't work. And so now he appeals to mercy. He appeals to mercy. Look in John chapter 19. We'll keep reading. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers also twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and clothed him with a purple robe. And they kept coming up to him and saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and were slapping his face. Just out of curiosity, are you getting a little angrier and angrier as we're reading this story? That's my Jesus they're beating up on. Well, what's Pilate doing here? It says in verse 1 that he took Jesus and had him flogged. Let me give you a little bit of background. The Romans, they had 3 different tiers of flogging, of scourging, of whipping, okay? So there were 3 different whippings. They had 3 different contexts. The first one was relatively light. Now, let's be very clear. No amount of flogging is light, okay? We don't enjoy that. It's not good. They would tie them up and they would whip them on the back is what they would do. But the first one was for people that were just being pests. They were just being problem people. And they said, look, we're going to whip you and we're going to release you because you're being a problem and we don't want you to be a problem anymore. So that was the first one. The second one was more severe. It was for people who had gone through an official trial, an official justice system. They had been found guilty, they were condemned, and their punishment was a whipping. That was the second one. It was worse. You were not going to recover from that quickly. You were going to be tore up pretty bad, but the intent was you weren't going to die from it. The third one was the bad one. The third one was you are sentenced to death, and we intend you to die at the end of this. The third one was the one that, man, I don't even want to hardly describe it. Let's just put it this way. By the time, the way they stopped was when the guy doing the whipping got too tired to whip anymore. Or the commander would say, hey, that's enough. It was so bad that once they were done, bones were exposed. Entrails were exposed. Many times the one being whipped would die right there after the whipping. The intent was they are going to die. After they would whip them in that way, they would then take them and execute them and put them on the cross. They would do the whipping to make their body weaker so that they would die quicker on the cross. So if there was an execution, you're going to be crucified, that type of whipping would happen. I believe that in this verse right here, it is referring to phase one. Well, why do you believe that, preacher? Well, I believe that because Luke 23:16 says this. Therefore, I will have him whipped, and then what? Release him. If he was intending to have him whipped and him die, then that would have been the third one. But if he's going to whip him and release him, that would be the first one. And so here in this text, John is describing that Pilate was not wanting, he had already said, I don't find him guilty. That's not number two. I want to release him. That's not number three. We got a number one whipping here, okay? But not only was he wanting to hurt Jesus, he was wanting to humiliate Jesus, and so he allowed the soldiers to humiliate him. It says here in verse 2, they twisted together a crown of thorns. They put it on his head. These would have been thorns about that long. They'd have been very sharp. The other Gospels say that when they put the crown of thorns on the head of Jesus, they took a rod and they beat the top of it so that the thorns would dig into his scalp. He would have been bleeding literally head to toe after this. Not only that, but they put a purple robe on him. This would have been one of the soldier's robes that he would have worn, the outer garment. And they would have taken this heavy garment and they would have put it on Jesus, and it would have connected to his skin and connected to the blood and the wounds. And then when they took that thing off, it would just rip it all open again. It wasn't good. Not only that, but they came up to him and began to mock him. Hail, King of the Jews. And they were slapping his face. And the Bible says they did all kind of other things to him while he was there. Why did he do all of that? It wasn't to hurt Jesus. It was to humiliate him, because Pilate was appealing to the sensibilities and to the heart and to the mercy of the Jewish leaders. Notice what he does next. Verse 4, he went outside again and he said to them, look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know I find no grounds for charging him. The second time Pilate says that. Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, here's the man. Now, imagine the sight that walked out. They called him the King of the Jews. He had a crown on. He had a robe on. But when he walked out, did he look very regal? Did he come up, you think, with chest up and shoulders back and walking out in this great strength? No. I don't think Pilate came out saying, here is the man, yeah! Here is the man, with sarcasm, because what came out did not look like a man. He came out beaten and bruised and bloodied and weak and tore up and humiliated. Pilate was wanting to release him but didn't have the guts to do it. And so he thought that the Jewish leaders would look on this beaten, humiliated man and would say, that's no king. Enough of that. You've done enough. But notice what the Jewish leaders said in verse 6. When the chief priests and the temple servants saw him, they shouted, this is not enough! Crucify! Crucify! they were not content with a whipped Jesus and a bloodied Jesus and a bruised Jesus. They would not be happy until there was a dead Jesus. Brings us to the second point. The rebellious world does not care about mercy. It does not care about mercy. Do you think the Nazis had mercy on the Jews during the Holocaust? Men, women, boys, girls. Do you think that Hamas had mercy when they stormed into Israel a few months ago? We've heard stories about it. There was no mercy. Even those that they captured and didn't kill, it wasn't because they were being merciful. It was because they were being strategic. What about this shooting in Moscow over the weekend? ISIS is claiming it, is a headline that I read. Do you think they were merciful as they murdered over 100 people in that concert hall? No, there's no mercy. Every one of them had already made up their mind that they were going to sin, and there was no mercy. The world is giving itself over to sin, and normal human sensibilities of mercy go out the window. A person intent on sinning will not be merciful to anyone that gets in the way of their sin. Normal people may see justice and mercy and stop and hold back, but no, not these that have given their heart over to rebellion and to sin. Well, Pilate has failed, and so now he appeals to a third thing. He appeals to authority. Look in verse 7. At the end of verse 6, he says, "Take him and crucify him yourselves, since I find no grounds for charging him." The third time he says, "I find no grounds," and he says, "You do it then. I'm not going to do it. You do it." And the Jews replied to them, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was more afraid than ever. Isn't that interesting? That hearing Jesus as the King of the Jews did not bother him, but hearing that he was the Son of God freaked him out. Why was that? Well, remember, he's a Roman. His religion was the Roman religion of a pantheon of gods. You had gods for everything. And in their religion and their superstition, I should say, they believed that the gods could take human form, that they would come incognito and become a form of a god. And these gods had sons. And if you did something to one of the god's sons, then you had the god against you, and that would be bad news. So he has this superstition about that. In another gospel, the Bible says that Pilate's wife had a dream the night before, and that she came and told Pilate, have nothing to do with that man. He may have shooed her off, but I have a feeling that her words echoed in his mind when he heard Son of God, and then his wife saying that, and his superstition took over, and he got nervous. He brings Jesus back in. He's about to let him go, but he brings him back in, and he talks to him again, and notice what he says. "Where are you from?" Verse 9. But Jesus did not give him an answer. So Pilate said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know who I am? I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you." And Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all if it hadn't been given you from above." This is why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin. Pilate was flexing here. And he said, "I have authority to let you go, or the authority to crucify. Don't you know that I have the authority to do that?" Pilate's authority to do that was because Caesar had appointed Pilate the governor, and he had the final decision making on this issue. Jesus said, "That is funny that you think you have authority, because the only governmental authority is that is approved and allowed by heaven." I feel like our government officials should remember that truth. Then he says, "Those that handed me over will be more guilty." Now, you're still going to have guilt for what you have done, but your authority is not what you think it is. You've been painted in a corner, and even though you think you have the authority to do this, you do not have the authority to do this. It is given to you from above. Pilate knew he was in a corner. In verse 12, from that moment, Pilate kept trying to release him. But the Jews shouted, "If you release this man, you're not Caesar's friend. Anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." Remember, who was it earthly that gave Pilate that authority? Caesar, good, good, good. Sometimes I got to help y'all out. But yeah, Caesar is the one that gave him the authority. Caesar had already gotten rid of one governor before Pilate because that governor couldn't keep things under control. And Pilate had a few instances as well. And so now they are saying, if you don't do what we want you to do, we're going to pitch a fit and we're going to tell Caesar and we're going to tell on you. And Caesar is going to come and remove you from this position. And what that Caesar liked to do is kill his guys that didn't do what he wanted them to do. So Pilate knew at that moment that he didn't really have the authority that he thought he had, but the Jews had the trump card because they were going to tell Caesar on him. And so Pilate got a little nervous when he heard these words. He brought Jesus outside and he sat down on the bema seat, the judge's seat, in a place called the stone pavement, but in Aramaic, Gabbatha. And it was the preparation day, that's Friday, for the Passover. So that's the preparation for the Sabbath that took place on Passover week, which had been Friday of Passover week. And it was about noon. Then he told the Jews, "Here's your king." And they shouted, "Take him away! Take him away! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Should I crucify your king? Your authority?" Now remember, the Jewish nation was built on the idea that God was their king, their true king, and that an earthly king was merely the extension of the heavenly king, Yahweh God. They would have viewed God as their authority in their life. These Jewish leaders, faced with the possibility that Jesus is going to be released, they now are responding to the question, should I crucify your authority and your king? And here is what they say. Not, he's not our king, but they say, we have no king but Caesar. Not even God is our king. Only Caesar is our king. Listen, I'll tell you what, I'm American. I live in Louisiana. I live in St. Martin Parish. I have a mayor-president. I have a governor. I have a president, but I only have one king, and his name is Jesus. And I do not care what happens. I am a citizen of heaven first and a citizen of all those other things after that. What these guys were saying is, we don't have a heavenly king. Oh, we got Caesar. They were willing to ignore the true authority in order to fulfill their sinful rebellion. And they ended up saying something and taking a position that no high priest in his right mind would ever take. Why? Because they had already sold themselves into sin. The third takeaway is this: the rebellious world does not care about authority. It does not care about authority. Because at the end of the day, when someone has chosen their sinful rebellion against God, they do not care about authority. The only thing that holds them back is the fear of getting in trouble or someone seeing them. But if they're doing something and no one is watching, there is nothing to stop them from doing what they're doing. They do not care about authority. They do not care about what the law says. They do not care about what God says. They don't care about what their parents say. They don't care about what their grandparents say. They don't care about what the Bible teaches. They do not care because they have already sold themselves to their sin. So when you see that action and that activity and you think, well, my goodness, you're rebelling against the authority in your life, it's because someone sold into sin does not care about authority. They don't care. Well, what happened then? Well, Pilate has tried to do everything, and he just can't do it. Verse 16. Then he handed him over to be crucified. Matthew and Mark say that this is when he was flogged and beaten. But Matthew and Mark use a different word than what John uses. John was, I believe, referring to the phase 1. This guy's being a pest. I'm just going to beat him and release him. I believe there was a second time where Jesus was whipped, but this time it was part of his execution. And this would have been the whipping, the bad one, number 3. and he would have been whipped and handed over for crucifixion, which is what Matthew and Mark say happens. Isn't it strange, though, that despite what Pilate tried to do to release him, he couldn't do it? And every step of the way, the Jews did what was wrong. The reason that all this happened, while Pilate was guilty of being a coward, while the Jews were guilty of being senseless and doing what they did, but the ultimate reason was because this was in line with the plan of God. I am glad that the story doesn't change every time I read it, because ultimately it was God's plan. Do you think John, on this Friday where he's writing and recording this and watching this and observing this, do you think John was a little confused about what was going on? Do you think John was watching this and saying, I don't know if God's in control. I don't know if Jesus is in control. I'm kind of losing my faith in what's happening here. Do you think John might have been there? I think he might have been there. On Friday, that's what it looked like. On Sunday, John had a different perspective. You see, just because things around us are senseless doesn't mean they don't make sense. I'll give you an example. The end times, one of these days, Jesus is going to come back. Y'all agree with that? We can argue about what that looks like, when that is, post, pre, mid, whatever. Bottom line, he's coming back. And the Bible teaches that things are going to get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse before Jesus comes back. How do you think it's going to get worse? Do you think it's going to get worse if people are operating according to the truth and according to justice? Nope. Do you think it gets worse because everybody's operating according to mercy? No. Do you think it's worse because everybody's operating according to authority? No. The reason that it gets worse and worse and worse is because the entire world loses their mind. And you think, well, they're losing their mind. God's not in control. No. He is absolutely in control. Just because everything around you is senseless does not mean it doesn't make sense when you look at it from the eyes of heaven. Now, it may not make sense to us because we are living in the Friday. It only will make sense to us when we get to the Sunday. And that will only happen after Jesus comes back. And so we make sense of the senseless by trusting in the one that makes it make sense. And that's Jesus.